To develop the work he and William Burns had begun there, a Chinese servant he had hired to oversee the transportation of his household possessions disappeared with all of Hudson's earthly belongings. While by most standards the loss wasn't great, he estimated it about 40 pounds, it came at a time when Hudson was practically penniless and had no resources with which to replenish even the bare necessities for his survival and continued ministry in China. Acquaintances had urged him to inform the proper authorities and have the man punished severely. But Hudson, who remained hopeful that the man would yet turn to God and repent, took a different course, which he described in the letter home. So I have sent him a plain, faithful letter to the effect that we know his guilt, and what its consequences might be to himself. That at first I had considered handing over the matter to the Ya men, the authorities, but remembering Christ's command to return good for evil, I have not done so, and did not wish to injure a hair on his head. I told him that he was the real loser, not I, that I freely forgave him, and besought him more earnestly than ever to flee from the wrath to come. I also added that though it was not likely he would give up such of my possessions as were serviceable to a Chinese, there were among them foreign books and papers that could be of no earthly use to him, but were very valuable to me, and that those at least he ought to send back. If only his conscience might be moved, and his soul saved, how infinitely more important that would be than the recovery of all I have lost. Do pray for him. Sometime later, a copy of this letter Hudson had sent to friends in England came into the hands of George Muller, the great man of faith and founder of the orphan homes in Bristol, England. Muller was so impressed by the Christ-like spirit of this young missionary he had never heard of, that he immediately sent to China a donation sufficient to cover Hudson's losses and continued to be a regular and generous supporter of Hudson's ministry as long as he lived. But long before the gift from George Muller arrived, in fact no sooner than he had written to forgive the man who had stolen from him, the mail arrived with a letter from Hudson's dear friend back in England, the Burgers. "Please accept the enclosed," Mr. Burger wrote, "as a token of love from myself and my dear wife." Inside was a check for 40 pounds. Having experienced God's faithfulness in such past situations, Hudson remained confident even as he wrote, "8 days before entering upon the care of the Ningpo hospital, I had not the remotest idea of ever doing so. Still less could friends at home have foreseen the need, and those needs were many. Right away, Hudson's informed the hired assistants who had been working for Dr. Parker that when the current funds expired at the end of the month, the financial support for the hospital would have to be provided by God. When many of them accepted his permission to find other work, Hudson was suddenly in as much need of a staff as he was of money. But when he shared this need with the Bridge Street Christians, many of them quickly volunteered their services. While the hospital's former employees weren't ready to believe in prayer as the minister's only resource, the prospect didn't seem to bother Hudson's friends at all. Hadn't their teacher been telling them that God was a real father who would never forget his children's needs? They gladly threw themselves into the volunteer work of the hospital, and the little fellowship of Christians immediately adopted the hospital and its concerns in prayer. There were few secrets in China, and the financial circumstances of the hospital in Ningpo was no secret. In almost no time after Hudson had informed the old staff of the truth of the situation, the patients knew all about it. Soon the community at large had heard, and everyone waited to see what would happen. Past, what little money had been left by Dr. Parker was expended, and Hudson's own supplies began to run low. There was much conjecture around town concerning the hospital's future. Naturally, Hudson and Maria, along with their Christian friends, were continuously in prayer about it. Hudson realized that this was a crucial test, with not just the continuation of the hospital, but also the faith of many young believers at stake. Day after day went by with no answer to their prayers. Finally, the morning came when Guiwa, the cook, appeared with serious news for Hudson. The very last bag of rice had been opened and was disappearing rapidly. "Then," Hudson replied, "the Lord's time for helping us must be close at hand." And so it was. For before that bag of rice was finished, a letter reached the young missionary that was among the most remarkable he had ever received. It was from Mr. Berger, and as before, it contained a check, this time for £50. But this letter went on to say that a heavy burden had come upon the writer, the burden of wealth he wanted to use for God. Mr. Berger's father had recently passed away, leaving him a considerable increase of fortune. The son wrote that since he had already had all the money required by his own needs, he was praying for guidance to know how the Lord might use this inherited money. Could his friends in China help him? The draft enclosed was for immediate needs, but he wanted them to pray about the matter and let him know if there was any way they could profitably use more. £50. There it lay on the table, and his far-off friend, knowing nothing about the last bag of rice or the many needs of the hospital, actually asked if he might send them more. Hudson Taylor was overwhelmed with thankfulness and awe. Suppose he had turned down Dr. Parker's offer to take over the hospital because of his lack of finances, or lack of faith. What a joyful celebration of praise the Taylors and their Christian friends had that day, and the patients marveled at the miracle. Many of them said, "Where is the idol that can do anything like that? Have they ever delivered us in our troubles or answered prayers like this?" 1860 to 1865. Though the new hospital ministry was encouraging for Hudson and Maria, it also meant extra work and responsibility. When added to their already busy schedule, it took a serious toll on their time, energy, and health. Soon after they assumed the management of the hospital, Maria wrote a letter to her husband's family back in England. "Hudson has again been prevented from writing to you, which makes the 4th fortnightly mail since he was able to send off a letter. I hope you will not, I know you will not, begin to think that his dear little daughter is winning his heart away from his beloved parents. If he could steal some hours from the night, he would do so, as he often has before, but his occupations leave him none to steal. He comes upstairs usually between 10 and 11 o'clock, tired out with the long day's work, and after resting a little, down he goes again to see some of his patients or make up medicines for others." Some months later, his own energies draining even as the need and the opportunities for evangelism in China seemed to multiply, Hudson shared his own concern for needed assistance in a letter to his father. "People are perishing, and God is so blessing the work, but we are wearing down and must have help. Do you know of any earnest, devoted young men desirous of serving God in China, who, not wishing for more than their actual support, would be willing to come out and labor here? Or for 4 or 5 such helpers? They would probably begin to preach in Chinese in 6 months' time, and in answer to prayer the means for support would be found." 6 years of ceaseless labor under the most difficult emotional and physical conditions had finally eroded Hudson Taylor's health. In the year of 1860, he and Maria took a 10-day vacation in the country, hoping he'd be rejuvenated. But when they returned to the hospital, the work continued to sap his energy. Hudson began to suspect that he might be suffering from tuberculosis. In May, he wrote home to his family. "What I desire to know is how I might best serve China. If I am too ill to labor here, and by returning home might reestablish health, if only for a time, or if I might rouse others to take up the work I can no longer continue, I think I ought to try." The next month, as his health continued to decline, he wrote again saying, "I trust, if it is the will of God, that I may be spared to labor for China. If not, all is well. Sometimes I think I may not live to see you. Sometimes I hope to be spared to labor long and more earnestly than ever for China. All in all is known to Him who needs to know all, and He will do all things well." Hudson grew weaker, so the Taylors sadly closed the Ningpo hospital and headed for Shanghai to book passage on a ship back to England, leaving the Joneses to watch over their growing congregation of new Ningpo Christians. The Taylors planned to do what they could at home to stir up increased interest and concern for China. They prayed that their furlough from China would be short, and that the proper medical care Hudson soon would be strong enough to return to the work that he had begun. But after a grueling round-the-world voyage home, prospects for the future were not encouraging. Though it looked as though Hudson would eventually recover from his illness, his doctors told him he would never be strong enough to live and work in China again. Hudson, refusing to accept their prognosis, continued to hope, pray, and to work for the day that he could return to China, and in the meantime he determined to do everything he could in England to contribute to Chinese missionary work. He helped raise money for the Joneses and the ongoing work in Ningpo by writing many letters to would-be supporters, explaining to them what was happening in China. And with the blessing and support of the Bible Society, Hudson began the task of revising the Romanized version of the New Testament in the Ningpo dialect. While in China, the Taylors had found that it was much easier for less educated Chinese to read and understand Chinese translations of books and scriptures which use a Western alphabet system with its 26 letters than to understand true Chinese writing with its thousands of characters. And when his health finally permitted it, Hudson resumed his medical studies in London in hopes that if the time came when he could indeed return to China, he'd be even more useful as a fully qualified physician. The appeal he made for 4 or 5 new missionaries before he left China had stirred much interest back in England. So for a time after arriving home, Hudson spent considerable time corresponding with a number of potential candidates. Only one young man finally went, James Meadows, and then not until 1862. But he was so much better prepared than Hudson Taylor had gone nearly 10 years before. Hudson not only spent time orienting him before he left, but he undertook responsibility for the young man's financial support as well. And because he'd not forgotten the lessons of his first years in China, Hudson made sure James Meadows was dependably supplied with regular and sufficient support for his work. The flurry of interest in China, which was stirred up by Hudson and Maria's return, soon faded. And because of the uncertainty of their future, the Taylors felt forgotten, half a world away from the work that they longed to do, living on a dreary street in a poor section of London's East Side. Hudson, at age 29, and Maria, at 24, must have felt at times as if life was passing them by as they lived in limbo, wondering what the future would hold. Not that their life in London was uneventful or unproductive. Their little daughter became a big sister to 3 younger brothers, and the Taylors learned more lessons in faith as they faced the constant challenge of trying to raise a growing active family on their very limited income. Then there was the ongoing work of the Ningpo New Testament. Hudson had decided that the translation would be even more helpful if it would be included marginal references and commentary in addition to the scriptural text. Fortunately, he had the assistance of another veteran missionary to China from another mission society, and he had the invaluable services of Wang Li-jung, a Chinese Christian who had voluntarily left his family and traveled back to England with the Taylors to help them on the journey and for as long as he could be useful. Hudson and Li-jung spent countless hours in Bible study and translation. A short excerpt from Hudson's journal shows the priority that he placed on the task. April 27th, revision, 7 hours. April 28th, 9.5 hours. 29, 11 hours. 30, 5.5 hours, Baptist Missionary Society meetings. May 1, revision, 8.5 hours. Visitors until 10 p.m. May 2, 13 hours. May 3, Sunday at Bayswater. In the morning, heard Mr. Lewis from John 3:33. Took the communion there in the afternoon. Evening, stayed at home and engaged in prayer about our Chinese work. May 4, revision, 4 hours. Correspondence and visitors. 5, 11.5 hours. May 6, 7 hours. Important interviews. May 7, 9.5 hours. May 8, 10.5 hours. May 9, 13 hours. May 10, Sunday morning with Li-jung on Hebrews 11, first part, A Happy Season. Wrote to James Meadows. Afternoon, prayer with Maria about leaving this house, about Meadows, true love, revision, etc.